Somewhere beneath the earth of everything we know, there is a silence that holds the shape of an older story. Before the first word was written, someone asked the question, who are we? Where did we come from? Why do we exist at all? What if everything you know about human history is wrong, not just incomplete, but deliberately rewritten? These are not modern questions. They are not the product of philosophy departments or late-night conversations. They are ancient, foundational, and in some ways, they remain unanswered. We are taught a version of history, one where apes descend from trees, where fire and stone mark progress, a slow, patient evolution, millions of years shaping minds until consciousness flickers into being. It is a powerful story, supported by bones, DNA, and the painstaking work of researchers across generations. But there is another story, one that predates the laboratories and carbon dating machines, a story written on clay, in a language humanity forgot for thousands of years, a story that names the ones who came before. This documentary is not about proving that story. It is not about disproving the first one either. It is about something quieter, something more difficult. It is about the question that comes before the question. What if we have been asking about our origins in the wrong way? Not because the answers we have are false, but because the framework itself may be incomplete. Consider what we accept as settled. Humanity arose in Africa, migrated outward, developed tools and language and culture. Civilization began roughly 6,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescents of the ancient world. Before writing, there was only darkness and forgetting. And yet, when writing did appear, when the earliest known texts emerged from the sands of what was once called Mesopotamia, they did not describe a world just beginning. They described a world already old. They spoke of kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, of beings who descended from the heavens, of creation as a process, an experiment, a deliberate fashioning of something new. These texts were not presented as metaphors, they were presented as records. Scholars have long debated what to make of these accounts. Some see them as mythology, no different from Greek or Norse stories of gods and heroes. Others see them as allegory, symbolic narratives meant to explain the natural world. But a smaller group has asked a different question. What if the people who wrote these texts meant them literally? This is not the same as claiming they were correct. It is simply asking whether we have dismissed the possibility too quickly, whether our filter for reading ancient documents has been shaped by assumptions we rarely examine. We call ourselves modern. We believe we have outgrown the superstitions of the past. But modernity carries its own superstitions. One of them is the belief that the major questions have been answered, that all that remains is filling in the details. What if the details are more than details? The tablets we will examine are not obscure. They have been studied for a century. They sit in museums across the world, translated, debated, catalogued. And yet, most people have never heard of them. Not because they are hidden, but because they do not fit easily into the categories we use to organize knowledge. Too mythological for science, too specific for mythology, too strange for history. They describe a world in which humanity was not an accident of nature, but a creation. A world in which the creators had names, hierarchies, agendas. A world in which the purpose of human existence was defined before we existed to question it. Whether any of this is true is not the point, not yet. The point is that these texts exist. They are among the oldest writings humanity has ever produced, and they tell a story that does not match the one we tell ourselves. That alone is worth attention. Over the next 2 hours, we will walk through these texts carefully. We will examine what they say, not what we wish they said or fear they might mean. We will look at the scientific questions that remain open. We will trace echoes across cultures and continents. And in the end, we will return to the question we began with. Who are we? Not because we can answer it, but because the act of asking has always defined us more than any answer could. The story begins in the desert, in a land now called Iraq, but which once bore a different name, a name that means, in the oldest language we know, the land of the civilized lords, Sumer. It is there that the first words were pressed into clay. It is there that the first records survived the millennia, and it is there that a story was written that has never quite been forgotten. The tablets do not whisper, they speak clearly, in a voice that has waited 4,000 years to be heard again. What they say will not answer all your questions, but it may change which questions you ask. The 19th century was an age of empires and excavations. European powers, flush with industrial wealth and colonial ambition, turned their attention to the ancient world. They dug into the sands of Egypt, Greece, and the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They were looking for treasure, for validation, for the roots of their own civilizations. But what they found was something else entirely. In the 1840s, a young British adventurer named Austin Henry Layard began excavating a mound in what is now northern Iraq. The locals called it Kuyunjik. Layard believed it might contain the remains of Nineveh, the ancient Assyrian capital mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. He was right. But Nineveh was only the beginning. Beneath the palaces and the statues and the fallen walls, Layard and his successors uncovered something far more significant than architecture. They found a library. Tens of thousands of clay tablets covered in a strange wedge-shaped script. Administrative records, legal contracts, medical texts, astronomical observations, and something else, stories, histories, accounts of gods and kings and the creation of the world. The script came to be called cuneiform, from the Latin word for wedge. It had been used across Mesopotamia for over 3,000 years before falling into silence around the 1st century of the Common Era. For nearly 2 millennia, no one on Earth could read it. That changed in the mid-19th century, when a handful of scholars, working from inscriptions in multiple languages, managed to crack the code. Suddenly, a world that had been voiceless began to speak. And the voice was strange. The tablets from Nineveh were Assyrian, dating to the 7th century before the Common Era. But the Assyrians were not the original authors. They were copyists, inheriting texts from an older civilization, the Babylonians. And the Babylonians, too, were inheritors. Their stories, their gods, their cosmologies were borrowed from an even earlier source, the Sumerians. Sumer is considered by many scholars to be the world's first civilization. It flourished in southern Mesopotamia roughly 5,000 years ago, before the rise of Egypt or the construction of Stonehenge. The Sumerians invented or independently developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, and urban planning. Their influence shaped every major civilization that followed in the region. And then, around 4,000 years ago, they faded. Not violently, as far as we know. The Sumerian language fell out of common use, replaced by Akkadian. Their cities were absorbed into later empires. Their gods were renamed, their stories rewritten. But the tablets remained. Buried in ruins, sealed in temple archives, forgotten but not destroyed. What makes clay significant is not romance, it is durability.
Papyrus rots, parchment burns, but clay, when fired or simply dried, can last for thousands of years. The Mesopotamians wrote on clay because it was cheap and available. They did not know they were creating the most permanent record system in human history. The tablets that survived did so not because they were treasured, but because they were ordinary. Temple accounts, legal disputes, school exercises, hymns, and occasionally something more. Among the recovered texts were stories of creation, stories of flood, stories of beings who came from the sky and shaped the world into its present form. These are not hidden documents, they are cataloged in museums. Scholars have devoted careers to their translation, and yet the full implications of what they describe remain contested. The primary creation narrative is known today as the Enuma Elish, named for its opening words, which translate roughly to "when on high." This is a Babylonian text, but its roots are older, drawing on Sumerian sources that predated by centuries. In the Enuma Elish, the world begins with two primordial beings, Apsu, the freshwater, and Tiamat, the salt water. From their union, generations of gods are born. These gods are noisy, chaotic. They disturb Apsu, who plots to destroy them. But one of the younger gods, Ea, kills Apsu first and establishes his dwelling upon the body of the slain. From Ea is born Marduk, who becomes the king of the gods. When Tiamat creates an army of monsters to destroy the younger gods, it is Marduk who faces her. He defeats her, splits her body in two, and from her remains creates the heavens and the earth. This is mythology, certainly, but mythology with structure, with hierarchy, with purpose. And then comes the moment of humanity's creation. Marduk, victorious, declares that the gods need servants, something to do the labor, to build the temples, to offer the sacrifices. And so, humanity is created. Fashioned from the blood of a defeated god mixed with clay. The blood of a god. That phrase recurs throughout the tradition. Humanity, in this account, is not a natural occurrence. It is a hybrid, a mixture of the divine and the earthy, created for a function. The Babylonians inherited this idea from the Sumerians, who told similar stories with different names. The god who provides the blood changes, the method varies, but the core concept remains. Humanity was made by beings who predated us, for reasons that served their purposes. This is not proof of anything. It is a text, a story, told by people who lived thousands of years ago. But it raises a question. Why did the earliest writers describe creation this way? Perhaps it was the only way they could imagine it. Perhaps the idea of a purposeless universe was too terrifying, and so they invented purpose in hindsight. Or perhaps they were recording something they believed had actually happened. We cannot know their minds. We can only read their words. And their words describe a world where the line between gods and humans was thin, where the origin of humanity was not a mystery, but a memory.
The word appears again and again in the texts, carved into clay, inscribed by scribes who believed they were recording the truth. Anunnaki. It is a Sumerian term, and like many ancient words, its precise meaning is debated. The most common scholarly interpretation breaks it into components: Anu, the sky god, and Na, meaning of or from, and Ki, meaning earth. Together, something like those of heaven and earth, or perhaps those who came from heaven to earth. In the earliest Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are a class of deities.
They are distinguished from another group, the Igigi, often described as lesser gods who served the greater ones. The relationship between these two groups is not always clear. Different tablets offer different hierarchies, but the Anunnaki appear consistently as powerful, ancient, and connected to both the sky and the underworld. They are not distant abstractions. They have names, personalities, conflicts. Anu sits at the top of the pantheon, the god of the heavens. Beneath him are his children, including Enlil, the lord of wind and storm, who rules the affairs of earth, and Enpi, the god of wisdom, water, and craftsmanship, who often plays the role of humanity's benefactor. These are not distant cosmic forces. They argue, they scheme, they fall in love, they make mistakes. In the mythology, Enlil and Enki frequently find themselves at odds. Enlil is stern, authoritarian, often hostile to humanity. Enki is clever, compassionate, and regularly intervenes to protect humans from Enlil's wrath. We will return to that story. For now, what matters is the consistency of the accounts. The Anunnaki were not described as metaphorical. They were described as beings who lived, who ruled, who made decisions with consequences. According to the Sumerian king list, one of the most remarkable documents recovered from the ancient world, kingship was lowered from heaven. It began in a city called Eridu, where the first kings ruled for extraordinary lengths of time. The king list records reign lengths that seem absurd by modern standards, tens of thousands of years for individual rulers. Some scholars suggest these figures are symbolic, representing dynasties rather than individuals. Others propose the Sumerians used a different counting system that later translators misunderstood. But the Sumerians themselves appear to have taken these numbers seriously. They marked the flood as a dividing line. Before the flood, the long rains. After, the numbers gradually become more plausible. This raises a curious question. If the Sumerians were simply inventing mythological histories, why introduce that dividing line? Why suggest that something fundamentally changed? Some researchers, outside the academic mainstream, have proposed that the Anunnaki were not gods in the traditional sense. They suggest the beings described were something else, something more tangible. This is a controversial interpretation. Most scholars consider it pseudo-history, a projection of modern concepts onto ancient mythology. They argue the Sumerians were doing what all ancient cultures did, personifying natural forces and constructing cosmologies to explain their world. And perhaps that is correct. But there is value in considering what the texts actually say, without immediately filtering them through the assumption of mythology. The texts say that the Anunnaki came from elsewhere, that they had knowledge humanity did not possess, that they established the first cities, the first laws, the first systems of governance, that they required labor, and so created humanity to provide it. These claims may be fantasy. They may be distorted memories of powerful human rulers elevated over generations into godhood. Or they may be something else. What is certain is that these stories are old, older than the Bible, older than the Hindu Vedas, among the oldest written narratives humanity possesses. They describe a world in which humans were not alone, in which beings of greater power walked among them, ruled them, shaped them. And the Sumerians did not present this as fiction or something to simply believe. They presented it as history, as fact, the foundation of their civilization. That certainty, whether justified or not, is worth contemplating. Because certainty is not something the ancient world offered lightly. They did not write for entertainment. They did not record myths for their own sake. Writing was difficult, time-consuming, and sacred. What was committed to clay was worth preserving forever. They chose to preserve this: the names, the lineages, the deeds of those who from heaven came.
There is a story told in several versions across the Mesopotamian tradition. It concerns a crisis among the gods, a labor dispute, if you will. Before humanity existed, according to these accounts, the younger gods performed the physical work of maintaining the world. They dug canals, they cultivated fields, they served the greater gods in an endless cycle of toil. And eventually, they rebelled. This rebellion is described most explicitly in a text known as the Atrahasis, named after its human protagonist. In this narrative, the Igigi, the working gods, gather outside the dwelling of Enlil and demand relief. They burn their tools, they threaten violence. Enlil is enraged but powerless to stop them. The gods are deadlocked. It is Enki who proposes a solution. Let us create something, he suggests, a substitute, a being that can perform the labor the gods no longer wish to do. And so the process begins. According to the Atrahasis, a god named Geshtue is slaughtered. His blood is mixed with clay. From this mixture, humanity is fashioned. The Sumerian term for this new being is sometimes translated as Lulu Emelu, meaning something like primitive worker or mixed creature. Note the composition: divine blood, earthy clay, the two elements combined to produce something new. Other texts describe different gods as the source of the divine element. Some emphasize the role of the goddess Ninmah in shaping the physical form. The details vary, but the core concept remains consistent. Humanity, in the Mesopotamian tradition, is a manufactured being, not created for its own sake, but to serve a function. The divine component grants intelligence and purpose. The clay grounds the creation in mortality. This can be read in many ways. Some scholars interpret the story as a meditation on the human condition. We are caught between the divine and the earthly, capable of transcendence, but bound to physical labor and death. The blood represents our spark of consciousness, our ability to imagine and create. The clay represents our mortality, our fragility, our return to the earth. This interpretation is valid. It fits the way mythology often operates, encoding philosophical truths in narrative form. But there is another dimension. In the ancient world, creation accounts served more than philosophical purposes. They established order. They explained hierarchy. They justified the structures of power that governs daily life. If humanity was created to serve the gods, then the temples that claimed to serve those gods were also serving the divine order. If the gods had granted kingship, then kings ruled by divine right. The creation narrative was not just a story, it was a political document, a cosmic constitution. This does not mean the Sumerians invented the narrative for political purposes. It may simply mean they organized their society around stories they believed to be true. And what did they believe? They believed that humanity had a beginning, that before us there were others, that those others created us for reasons of their own, and our purpose was defined before we ever existed to question it. This is a profoundly different view of human dignity than the one we hold today. We believe, generally, that human beings have intrinsic worth, that we are ends in ourselves, not means to someone else's purpose. The Mesopotamians did not share this assumption. In their understanding, purpose was external, meaning was given, not discovered. And yet, within this framework, humans were not despised. They were necessary. The gods needed them. Over time, the relationship grew more complex. Humans prayed. Gods responded.
Temples were built, sacrifices offered, a kind of reciprocity developed. But the origin remained fixed. Humans were made, not born, not evolved, made. There is something in this idea that resonates even now. The sense that we are not quite natural, that something about humanity does not fit the pattern of the animal kingdom, that our consciousness, our creativity, our restless drive to understand the universe is somehow anomalous. Science offers explanations: the evolution of language, the expansion of the prefrontal cortex, the development of culture as adaptation. These explanations may be correct. They may account for everything we experience as uniquely human. But they do not entirely quiet the sense that something is missing, that the leap from ape to philosopher is too vast, too sudden, too strange. The ancient texts do not fill that gap with certainty. They fill it with story. And perhaps that is all any origin account can do. But the story they tell is specific. It names the process. It describes the ingredients. It explains the purpose. Blood and clay, divinity and earth, a worker shaped in the image of the gods. Whether memory or metaphor, it remains the oldest account of human origins we possess. And it has never entirely faded from the human imagination.
There is a document that has puzzled scholars since its discovery: the Sumerian king list. It claims to record every ruler from the beginning of kingship until the time the tablet was written. The list begins with a simple statement: after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. What follows is a sequence of kings and cities with reign lengths attached. The first 8 kings ruling before the flood are recorded as having reigned for a total of 241,200 years. This is not a scribal error. The numbers are consistent across multiple copies of the list, found in different locations and dating to different periods. The Sumerians and later the Babylonians repeated these figures with apparent seriousness. After the flood, the numbers change. They begin to decrease, gradually approaching something recognizable as normal human lifespan. By the end of the list, reign lengths are measured in decades, not millennia. The transition is marked clearly. The flood swept over. Then a new dynasty begins, with kingship descending once more. What are we to make of this? The most common academic explanation is that the pre-flood figures are mythological. They represent an idealized past, a golden age before disaster. The decreasing reign lengths after the flood reflect the gradual corruption of the world, a theme found in many ancient cultures. This interpretation is reasonable. It fits patterns of mythological thinking seen elsewhere. But it raises its own questions. Why invent a break? If the Sumerians were creating a legendary past, why introduce the flood as a dividing line? Why suggest that something fundamentally changed in the nature of kingship, the length of life, the relationship between humans and the divine? Some researchers have proposed alternative explanations. One suggestion is that the pre-flood numbers refer not to individual reigns, but to dynasties. A number like 28,800 years might represent the cumulative rule of a city-state, not a single king. Another suggestion is that the Sumerians used a different numerical system than we assume. Perhaps the numbers were symbolic, representing categories of importance rather than literal duration. A third possibility, entertained by fewer scholars, is that the numbers were taken literally but referred to beings who were not fully human. If the Anunnaki ruled directly before the flood, their lifespans might be recorded as they were believed to be, vastly longer than those of their successors. None of these explanations is universally accepted. The king list remains an anomaly, a document that fits awkwardly into our understanding of ancient record-keeping. But one thing is clear. The Sumerians believed the flood was a turning point. Before the waters, one kind of world. After, another. This belief in a pre-flood era is not unique to Sumer. Cultures around the world preserve stories of a time before a great cataclysm. Ages of the world, often numbered 3 or 4 or 5, ending in fire or ice or flood. Why would so many cultures share this idea? Perhaps because floods are common catastrophes. Every civilization near a river or coast has experienced devastating inundation. The story of the flood may be simply the universal memory of local disasters writ large into cosmic significance. Or perhaps something did happen, something that affected large portions of the world, something remembered imperfectly across cultures and continents. We will explore that possibility shortly. For now, consider the Sumerian perspective. Before the flood, kings ruled for millennia. Beings descended from heaven walked the earth. The world was young, or perhaps very old, depending on how you count. After the flood, everything changed. Lifespans shortened, the gods became more distant, kingship continued, but it was no longer the same. Something had been lost. This is not a story of progress. It is a story of decline, a fall from a higher state to a lower one. And at the center of the fall is water, rising, sweeping, destroying, until only a few remained.
The story appears in clay, older than the version most people know. A man receives a warning. A flood is coming that will destroy all life. He is told to build a vessel, seal it with pitch, bring aboard the seeds of living things. He does so. The waters rise. Everything is destroyed. Eventually, the waters recede. The man emerges into a changed world, offers a sacrifice, and receives a blessing. This is not Noah. This is Ziusudra, or Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim, depending on which version you read. The Mesopotamian flood narratives predate the Hebrew Bible by centuries. Scholars have long recognized the parallels: the boat, the warning from a deity, the duration of the flood, the bird sent out to find land, the sacrifice upon dry ground. These similarities are too specific to be coincidence. Most scholars agree that the biblical account was influenced directly or indirectly by Mesopotamian tradition. This does not diminish the religious significance of the Noah story for those who hold it sacred. It simply places it in historical context. But the Mesopotamian version adds details the Bible does not preserve. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the most complete version, Utnapishtim tells the hero how he was warned by the god Ea. Ea could not violate the decree of the gods directly, so he spoke to a wall, knowing Utnapishtim would overhear. Wall, wall, hear my words. Reed house, remember what I say. Tear down your house, build a boat, abandon possessions, seek life. The specificity is striking, the deception, the urgency, the strange instruction to speak to a wall, as though the god were constrained by rules he could not openly break. The flood in these accounts is not a natural disaster. It is a decision made by the gods, or by one god in particular, Enlil, who had grown weary of humanity's noise and proliferation. Enlil wanted silence. He wanted to undo what had been done. But Enki intervened.
Because Enki had created humanity, or at least participated in the creation, he felt responsibility for his creations, and so he warned one man, one family, one boat. This is theological drama, not just natural history. The flood is the battleground for a conflict among the gods. Enlil's desire for order through destruction, Enki's insistence on preservation, humanity caught in the middle, helpless but not without advocates. When the waters finally recede and Utnapishtim emerges, Enlil is furious. Who revealed the secret? Who allowed any human to survive? But his anger fades. Utnapishtim is granted immortality, a unique gift, and sent to live at the ends of the earth. Humanity survives, but with the knowledge that the gods could destroy them again if they chose. This is the narrative. But is there anything behind it? Geologists and archaeologists have debated this question for over a century. Did a great flood actually occur? Could it have given rise to these persistent stories? The evidence is mixed. There are layers of sediment in Mesopotamian archaeological sites suggesting significant flooding events. The region is prone to river floods, and catastrophic inundation could easily have devastated early cities. But the stories describe something more than a river flood. They describe a world covered in water, a reset, an ending. Some researchers have pointed to the flooding of the Black Sea basin roughly 7,000 years ago as the Mediterranean broke through and inundated a freshwater lake. If this occurred as rapidly as some models suggest, it could have displaced large populations and left a lasting cultural memory. Others suggest that the end of the last ice age, some 12,000 years ago, involved dramatic sea level rise and coastal flooding that affected human settlements worldwide. Not a single flood, but a process unfolding over millennia. Still others maintain that flood myths are simply what happens when agricultural civilizations develop near rivers. Floods happen. They kill people, they destroy crops, the trauma becomes cultural memory, and over generations the story grows. None of these explanations is definitive. What is definitive is that the story exists, that it was told repeatedly across the ancient world, that it was considered important enough to write down, to copy, to preserve, and that at the center is always the same claim. The world that was is not the world that is. Something ended, something was washed away, and only a few carried the memory forward.
We turn now from ancient texts to ancient bones. The fossil record is one of humanity's greatest achievements of understanding. It has allowed us to trace the history of life across billions of years, to see the shapes of creatures that vanished long before consciousness existed. But the fossil record is not complete. It cannot be. Fossilization is a rare event, requiring specific conditions of burial, mineralization, and preservation. For every creature that becomes a fossil, millions leave no trace at all. This incompleteness is not a failure of science. It is a feature of the process. Scientists acknowledge it openly. Gaps are expected, and over time, many have been filled as new discoveries are made. But some gaps remain more troubling than others. The origin of modern humans, Homo sapiens, is one of the most studied questions in paleoanthropology. The current consensus places our emergence in Africa, somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago.
We share ancestors with other hominids, and the family tree is more complex than a simple line, with branches and interbreedings and extinctions. This picture is supported by genetic evidence, comparative anatomy, and geographic distribution of fossil finds. It is a robust framework tested by decades of research. And yet, within this framework, there are anomalies, questions not fully resolved. One concerns the rapidity of change. Certain developments in human evolution appear with surprising speed. The expansion of the brain size, the emergence of symbolic behavior, the development of language. Gradualism, the idea that evolution proceeds in small incremental steps, is the dominant model. But some researchers argue that human evolution includes punctuated episodes, moments of rapid change followed by long periods of stability. This is not fringe science, it is a legitimate debate within evolutionary biology. What is less often discussed is what might have caused such punctuation. If change was rapid, what drove it? Standard explanations include environmental pressure, climate change, new food sources, and competition with other species. These are plausible and well supported, but some have wondered whether the explanations are sufficient. Consider the human brain. It consumes roughly 20% of the body's energy, despite being only about 2% of body mass. In evolutionary terms, such an expensive organ should require significant justification. It should confer obvious survival advantages. And in some ways, it does. Tool use, planning, social coordination. But the human brain also produces things with no obvious survival value. Art, music, abstract mathematics, philosophy, the drive to understand the cosmos itself. Why would natural selection produce a brain capable of contemplating the infinite? The question is not unanswerable, it is simply open. Some researchers suggest these capacities are byproducts, side effects of selection for more practical abilities. A brain that can plan for the hunt can also plan for the stars. A brain that recognizes patterns in the forest can also recognize patterns in numbers. This is plausible, it may be correct, but it does not entirely quiet the sense that the human mind is, in some ways, overkill, more than survival required, more than competition demanded. And this brings us back to the ancient texts. The Sumerians described humanity as a created being, fashioned with divine blood. They attributed our intelligence, our spark, to something added, something not naturally occurring. Science does not require this explanation. Science has its own framework, and it is powerful. But the question remains, hovering at the edge of what we know. Why are we like this? Why is human consciousness so unlike anything else we observe in nature? The fossil record does not answer. The bones do not speak. They show us what was. They cannot tell us why.
If the fossils are silent, perhaps the genes can speak. The revolution in genetic science over the past half-century has transformed our understanding of life. We can now read the sequence of nucleotides that encode every organism's blueprint. We can compare genomes, trace lineages, and estimate the timing of evolutionary divergences. But genetics has also raised new questions. One concerns the nature of non-coding DNA. For decades, scientists recognized that only a small portion of the human genome, roughly 2%, directly codes for proteins. The rest was long dismissed as junk DNA, accumulated debris from millions of years of evolution, serving no current function. This view has changed dramatically.
Researchers have discovered that much of the so-called junk DNA is not junk at all. It includes regulatory sequences that control when and how genes are expressed. It includes remnants of ancient viral insertions. It includes stretches of repetitive sequences whose function is still being investigated. The human genome is more complex than a simple instruction manual. It is layered, redundant, and full of regulatory mechanisms we are only beginning to understand. This complexity is not evidence of design in any scientific sense. Evolution is entirely capable of producing complex systems through cumulative selection. But it does invite humility. We thought we understood the genome. We thought we knew what mattered and what was junk. We were wrong about that. The question of what else we might be wrong about remains open. Another question concerns the origin of certain genetic changes. The human genome differs from the chimpanzee genome by only about 1 to 2%. Within that small percentage are the differences that make us human: the capacity for language, the structure of the brain, the shape of the hand, the curve of the spine. Some of these changes are well understood. Others are not. A few researchers have noted that certain key changes appear in the genome without clear precursors. The genes are there, but the gradual steps that would have produced them are not always evident. This is not proof of anything extraordinary. It may simply reflect the incompleteness of our knowledge, the limitations of our methods. Evolutionary biology is a young science. But it is worth noting that the mystery persists. And alongside the question of what changed, there is the question of when. Genetic clocks suggest that certain significant changes in the human lineage occurred relatively recently in evolutionary terms. The last 50 to 100,000 years seem to mark a period of acceleration, during which modern human behavior emerged and spread across the globe. What triggered this acceleration? Climate change is one hypothesis. Shifting environments during the ice ages may have created selection pressures favoring innovation, cooperation, and cognitive flexibility. Population dynamics is another. As human groups grew and interacted, ideas could spread and compound, creating a cumulative culture that accelerated development. These are scientific explanations, grounded in evidence and logic. But they do not account for everything. They do not explain the sheer improbability of what emerged. A species that sends probes to the edge of the solar system, that records its thoughts in languages transmitted through space, that asks persistently and restlessly where it came from and why it exists. The ancient texts offer a different explanation. They say we were made, that something was added to us, that our spark is not entirely our own. Whether metaphor or memory, it speaks to the same unease, the sense that we are not quite at home in our own origins, that something about us remains unexplained.
Of all the details in the ancient narratives, one has drawn particular attention: gold. In multiple Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are described as mining gold. It is the reason, according to some interpretations, that humanity was created. The gods needed workers. The work was extracting gold from the earth. This is a specific claim, and it has generated speculation ranging from the scholarly to the imaginative.
In the standard mythological interpretation, gold is symbolic. It represents the sun, the divine, the eternal. It does not tarnish. It does not corrode. It is, in a sense, immortal. Ancient cultures universally valued gold, not for industrial applications, but for its beauty and its association with the heavens. The sun is gold. The gods are gold. To possess gold is to possess a piece of the eternal. This interpretation is well supported by archaeological and textual evidence. Gold appears in royal burials, temple offerings, and the regalia of kings. It is a marker of status and sacred power. But some have wondered whether there might be more to the story. Gold has properties that make it useful for more than decoration. It is an excellent conductor of electricity. It is resistant to corrosion, even in harsh environments. It is used in modern electronics, aerospace technology, and medical devices. A small group of researchers operating outside mainstream academia have suggested that the ancient obsession with gold might reflect a practical purpose we no longer understand, that the beings described in the texts might have had technological applications for gold the Sumerians could only describe in symbolic terms. This is speculative. There is no physical evidence to support it. No ancient mining operations have been found that match the scale the stories would imply. No technological artifacts have been recovered. And yet, the idea persists. Perhaps because it offers a kind of logic to the narrative. If the Anunnaki were simply gods, why would they need labor? Gods, by definition, are beyond material needs. But if they were something else, something with physical requirements, then the creation of a workforce makes sense. This is the danger of reading ancient texts too literally. It is also the danger of reading them too metaphorically. The truth, if there is one, may lie somewhere in between. The Sumerians valued gold. They wrote about beings who demanded gold. They created elaborate mythologies around its extraction and offering. Whether this reflects cosmic truth or cultural obsession is not something we can determine from the texts alone. But the question is worth holding. Why gold? Of all the materials in the earth, why would the oldest narratives focus on this particular metal? The answer may be simple. Gold is beautiful, and humans have always been drawn to beauty. Or the answer may be more complex, a fragment of a story we no longer fully understand. Either way, the gold in the temples gleamed, the gold in the tombs survived, and the questions it raises endure longer still.
If the stories of Sumer were unique, they might be easier to dismiss, but they are not unique. Across the world, in cultures separated by oceans and millennia, similar patterns appear. In ancient Egypt, the gods create humanity from clay and divine breath. The first humans are fashioned on the potter's wheel by the ram-headed god Khnum, while the goddess Hathor grant them the spark of life. In Mesoamerica, the Maya Popol Vuh describes multiple attempts by the gods to create humanity. The first humans, made of mud, dissolve. The second, made of wood, are destroyed in a flood. Only the third, made of maize mixed with the blood of the gods, succeed. In Hindu traditions of India, the Vedas and Puranas describe ages of the world, each ending in cataclysm. Before the current humanity, other races existed, guided by beings who descended from the stars. In Africa, creation stories from traditions as diverse as the Dogon of Mali, the Zulu of South Africa, and the Akan of Ghana speak of beings who came from the sky, taught humanity the arts of civilization, and departed with promises or warnings. These parallels are not exact. Each culture has its own context, vocabulary, and theological concerns. The similarities may reflect common psychological patterns, the tendency of the human mind to generate certain kinds of stories. Or they may reflect something else. The diffusionist hypothesis suggests that ideas spread from a single origin, carried by migration, trade, or cultural contact. If a great civilization existed before known history, it might have seeded ideas across the world that later developed independently. This hypothesis is controversial. It was popular in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but fell out of favor as scholars recognized the diversity and independence of human cultures. And yet, the parallels remain. Not proof of a single origin, but a pattern worth noticing. The same elements recur: creation from clay and divine essence, beings from the sky, a great flood, long-lived ancestors, the founding of civilization by teachers who came from elsewhere. Perhaps the human mind gravitates toward these themes. Perhaps they represent universal anxieties and hopes expressed in the only language available. Or perhaps they are memories. Fragmented, distorted, translated across languages and centuries, but preserving something real. Something that happened so long ago that only the shape remains. The oldest stories humanity tells are not about heroes or wars. They are about beginnings. And the beginnings across the world sound strangely alike. Stories are fragile. They exist only in the telling. They change with each narrator, each generation, each translation. Details are lost. Meanings shift. What was literal becomes metaphor. What was metaphor becomes literal. And yet, some stories survive. They survive floods and fires, conquests and exiles, the death of languages, and the collapse of empires. They survive because someone, somewhere, thought them worth preserving. The Mesopotamian tablets survived because clay is durable and deserts are dry. But the stories on those tablets are older than the tablets themselves. They were told before they were written, sung around fires in villages that left no trace. How much has been lost? We cannot know. The Sumerians claimed their civilization was ancient, descended from an age before the flood. If there was a pre-flood civilization, its records would have been destroyed. What we have are echoes, fragments that survived in the memories of survivors. This is speculative. There is no archaeological evidence of a global civilization before known Neolithic cultures. The cities we have found are the oldest cities there are, as far as current evidence shows. But absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. Coastlines have changed, rivers have shifted, millennia of sediment have buried what once stood in the open. We have explored only a fraction of the Earth's surface and less of its seafloor. What might be found if we knew where to look? The Maya of Central America preserved their stories through codices made of bark paper. When the Spanish arrived, they burned nearly all of them. Only 4 survive. An entire civilization's literature, history, and science reduced to ashes. What was in those books? We will never know. The same process has occurred across the world. Conquest, conversion, assimilation. Old stories replaced with new ones or simply forgotten. And yet, something always survives.
The Anunnaki stories were forgotten for 2,000 years. Then the tablets were found. Then the scripts were deciphered, and the old voices spoke again. Perhaps other voices are waiting, buried in clay, carved in stone, remembered in songs that have not yet been recorded. The human story is longer than we know, and memory, however fragile, has a way of persisting. Not because it is accurate, but because it matters. Because someone, somewhere, thought the story was worth telling. And so they told it. And so it survived.
We have walked a long path together, through ancient cities and crumbling tablets, through the names of gods and the dust of bones, through the language of genes and the silence of deep time. And we have arrived not at an answer, but at a place of greater uncertainty. The stories we have examined are old. They are strange. They do not fit easily into the categories we use to organize knowledge. They describe a world in which humanity was created deliberately by beings who came from elsewhere. They describe long ages before the flood and a cataclysm that changed everything. They describe a relationship between the human and the divine that is more intimate and more troubling than the religions that came later. Are these stories true? We cannot say. They may be mythology, the product of minds making sense of a mysterious world. They may be allegory, encoding philosophical truths in narrative form. They may be distorted memories of real events filtered through millennia of retelling. Or they may be something else, something we do not yet have a framework to understand. What is certain is that the questions remain open. Science has given us remarkable tools for understanding the past, but science is not finished. It never is. New discoveries continue to revise our understanding. New questions continue to emerge. And alongside the scientific questions are the older ones. Who are we? Where did we come from? Why are we here? These questions are not answerable by genetics or archaeology alone. They touch on meaning, purpose, the nature of existence itself. The ancient texts do not answer these questions, but they remind us that we are not the first to ask them. Thousands of years ago, people carved words into clay, trying to understand their place in the cosmos. They looked at the stars and saw the dwellings of the gods. They looked at themselves and saw creatures caught between heaven and earth. They told stories that placed human existence in a context larger than any single life. Those stories still resonate, not because they are proven true, but because they speak to something deep in the human experience, the sense that we are part of something larger, the suspicion that our origins are not quite what they seem, the longing for a narrative that makes sense of the strange fact of being alive. Perhaps we will never know the full truth of our origins. Perhaps the past is too distant, the evidence too fragmentary, the biases too entrenched. But we can keep asking. We can hold the questions open. We can listen to the old voices, not with credulity, but with respect. They knew things we have forgotten. They saw the world through eyes unclouded by the assumptions we take for granted. And perhaps in listening, we will learn something, not about the past, but about ourselves, about what it means to be human, to stand between the clay and the stars, looking up, looking back, and wondering.